We're very fortunate today to have from far away joining us Dr. Kathleen McNaught, and she is the Assistant Staff Director of Child Welfare at the American Bar Association Center. And anyone who has done any work beyond their own county and gotten involved in education issues, she's kind of a household word. You know, we hear Dr. McNaught and think education, we're going to learn a lot. So we're very fortunate to have her. She provides a lot of training and technical assistance around the country on a variety of child welfare issues, but has focused on the educational needs of children in foster care. She is the project director for the Legal Center for Foster Care and Education, and she's authored several publications, and I think I even did a little foreword for one of the publications. Yes. Yeah, we collaborated. That's my claim to fame. And Jessica Feierman is the supervising attorney of juvenile law at the Juvenile Law Center in Philadelphia. I don't think that is mentioned in your materials, but she has engaged in litigation and amicus efforts on a wide variety of subjects, including juvenile life without parole, institutional conditions, and adult sentencing. She has done a lot of high-level stuff. She's done a great deal with amicus briefs for the Supreme Court, and she has also engaged in policy advocacy and public education on juvenile justice and child welfare issues. Before joining the Juvenile Law Center, she was a litigation fellow at the ACLU National Prison Project, and she was a teaching fellow at Georgetown. So you probably know this guy, Shay. Have you ever heard of him? She was a law clerk to the Honorable Warren Ferguson on the Ninth Circuit. She graduated from Wesleyan University and University of Pennsylvania Law School, and she has an LLM in advocacy from Georgetown Law Center. And so please join me in welcoming these fine experts to follow up and take what we have learned so far today to the next level.
Well, thank you, Judge Cohen. That was a wonderful introduction, and I'm thrilled to be here with my colleague and friend, Jessica Feierman. And I'm so happy that Judge Cohen remembered that. I always, whenever I see her, I think about the very first publication I wrote when I came to the ABA, and Judge Cohen was kind enough to write a foreword talking about the educational issues for kids in the foster care system. And I guess the thing that always gives me pause is I think it was 2003 or 2004, and so we've been at this a while, and many of you have been at it longer. But one of the reasons I'm so excited and honored that you invited me here today is I feel that I first got involved with some of the work in Iowa. It was about 2008, 2009. Fostering Connections, which we're going to talk about in a minute, had just passed. We had just started a project that I'm about to tell you about. And there was just some great momentum and excitement and direction here in the state. And it's just really a neat time to be doing this as long as we've been doing this, to be able to kind of come back to a state and really hear and take part and help cheer you on for the successes you've had. And really think about sort of phase 2 of where you want this work to go. I think Jessica and I are a little humbled by sitting and listening to the leadership that you had here this afternoon talk so clearly and eloquently about what they would like to see and the charge I feel that they've given all of you to move this work forward. And then to hear young people really, really hit home, you know, the important messages and tell us what the experience is like and where we need to improve. I mean, it's just been a great presentation so far. So, Jessica, do you want to add anything as a way of introduction, or should we just get going?
Oh, here we go. Okay.
You have to stay a certain distance apart.
Kathy, let's see. Is that working okay? This isn't good. It's not good. I'm just very happy to be here, and let's stop at that until I can make this thing stop buzzing at me.
Turn it off and we'll just use one. Okay.
We're going to show the spirit of collaboration. We're going to share.
Yeah. And speaking of sharing, I think that the thing to know about Jessica and I, so I'm with the American Bar Association Center on Children and the Law, and we're located in Washington, D.C., and Jessica's with the Juvenile Law Center that's located in Philadelphia. And I met Jessica probably back in 2004, 2005. We started realizing that our projects overlapped in our interest in this issue. And in 2007, we launched a project known as the Legal Center for Foster Care and Education. And it's with another wonderful organization who are our colleagues and friends, the Educational Law Center out of Philadelphia. And together our three organizations really lead this Legal Center for Foster Care and Education. It stemmed out of the several years of work leading into that, where I would travel around the country doing trainings, talking to folks on the ground, and realizing there was a lot of work happening, a lot of great stuff, just like is here. And it was our attempt to kind of capture that and to really help guide states and jurisdictions in the work that they're doing. So many of you, we go to different states and they're struggling with a lot of the same challenges you are, and it's a really efficient way to provide our assistance, sort of our legal analysis and our help to the great work that you're doing on the ground. So if there's one web link I encourage you to remember as you walk away from this presentation, it's the web link that I have there, the www.fostercareandeducation.org. We have worked very hard over these years to develop publications, question and answer, short materials, briefs, longer detailed information. We maintain a database of information of examples of work around this issue from a whole host of states. We have a listserv group that I think many of you are on, but if not, I encourage you to join, where we let folks know about new publications, new issues, new resources. So, great. So to start, I realize I do recognize some great faces, but there's a lot of faces that I don't. And I don't think we've really taken a moment today, at least, to really figure out who we have in the room. And so if you wouldn't mind humoring me, and for all of you who are judges and juvenile court officers, could you just raise your hand? Okay, welcome and thanks for being here. How about folks, how about attorneys? Agency attorneys, parent attorneys, child attorneys? Great. Educators, folks from schools, school districts, central offices? Terrific. Child welfare agencies, state level folks, state folks? And then county offices? Wonderful. Who am I forgetting? Providers. Wonderful. Anybody else I've forgotten? A role I haven't mentioned. Foster parent, wonderful, thank you. And youth, we have young people here. I think some of the folks that presented left, but we have some young people, great. Great. All right, terrific. Well, I think that's very helpful to us to know, and I think the purpose of what we're doing here is to really talk about cross-system collaboration, and that's exactly who you have in the room right now, so that's perfect. I think many of you work on a regular basis with kids in foster care, and so understand some of the data behind the story. First, I know we have a good number of educators, so if this isn't data you often have a chance to hear, we just wanted to sort of put that in perspective, to know that the majority of kids who are in care nationwide are school-age youth, that we do have a disproportionate number of children in the foster care system of color. There is racial and ethnic disproportionality, that we have roughly this even split on boys and girls in the system. I think another data point here that's pretty important to point out are these last two bullets, especially for some of the folks working in the education system. I always find they tend to be a bit of a surprise, right? That 60% of kids who are involved in the foster care system return home. Does that surprise anybody in the room? And I think here in Iowa, that's a pretty accurate number in terms of your return home. Higher maybe here? 68%. 50% staying in care for less than a year. So some of these real critical issues when we're talking about the educational experiences that kids have in foster care, it's really important to know that those experiences vary significantly. And for many children, it's a very, very temporary situation. And for some, it's longer. And we certainly heard from the young people this morning that they experienced longer periods of time in care. Jessica's going to walk you through a little bit of the data around the juvenile justice population.
This is the eye test portion of our presentation. So no, what I actually wanted to show you here was just this graph for those who don't do as much work in the juvenile justice system. The involvement of kids in the justice system peaked around 1997 and has been declining steadily ever since. And so actually what you see here is 2010. The 2011 chart has also just come out and the decline continues. So overall, many fewer kids in the juvenile justice system than used to be. The majority of youth in the juvenile justice system are in for relatively minor offenses. A lot of larceny, simple assault, fights in school, though obviously some youth are in the system for much more serious offenses. Kathy mentioned racial disparities in the foster care, child welfare system. We see the same thing in the juvenile justice system. Even when you control for the type of offense and a host of background characteristics, you see kids of color going into the system much more than white children. And even, and just as a sort of a point of reference, I think the way we're going to do this is pass the microphone back and forth, and Kathy will take us primarily through the child welfare issues, and I'm going to try to pepper in some of the juvenile justice issues.
Great, thanks. You know, we have this slide in here to just sort of walk through what the experience of being involved in the child welfare system looks like. I think we probably can't do it justice, and I think we had some real experts leading the session before us who I think really painted this picture pretty clearly in terms of what it's like. I think the important point when we talk about the educational outcomes for young people who are court involved in either system, it's just remembering the frame of what we're talking about, remembering the frame of, for children involved in the child welfare system, the abuse and neglect that's occurred, that we're talking about being removed from family and friends and siblings, that we're talking about living in a strange environment all of a sudden without a lot of warning at times. Not having those things that are important to you, not having the comforts that you're used to, and a lot of uncertainty. We heard very clearly from the young people who spoke earlier about worried about parents and worries about siblings and worries about what's going on. And so I just think it's really critical that even though we're going to dive into and focus a spotlight on education, to remember that it's in the midst of all of this and the mobility that we're saying now it's where will I go to school? And by the way, we have to sit and learn and be ready to learn and be achieving and be energetic and be, have our focus and be able to study. And I think when we really challenge ourselves to think about that, that's an incredibly high expectation at times to be doing that in that context. And we have to remember that when we talk about the supports that kids need to be successful. I think it was it Justice Apple who spoke a little bit about sort of data and some of the limitations of data. I thought it was interesting. We are both desperate, I'll use that word, and I think it's true, for more data about how kids do educationally and what interventions work well for kids educationally when they're involved in the court system. But at the same time, when we do have, whether it's state or regional or local data, we do tend to spotlight it because it begins to paint the picture. Do we need more? We sure do. Do we need better? We sure do. But I think when you start to see the glimmers that are appearing, and there's more and more every year, it really is painting the picture that we've got some big problems that we need to address. Issues related to high school completion, for certain. Issues related to reading and math on grade level. Issues related to dropout and disciplinary issues. and repeating grades. And finally, you know, it's the small group of young people. We had several of them here today, but it's important to remember that it's a very, very small minority of kids in the foster care system who enter into post-secondary, and even a smaller percentage of those who complete it. So we've got a lot of work to do.
Unfortunately, kids in the juvenile justice system are also struggling, and actually that whirlwind slide that goes over the experience of kids in the child welfare system, many of those are the same problems shared by kids in the juvenile justice system. And particularly when we talk about education, that lack of stability, just the very fact of placement in a juvenile justice placement is taking kids out of their home school to somewhere else, and hopefully to return back. We know that they are starting out at a disadvantage. Educational issues are a risk factor for delinquency, so kids going into the system are performing below grade level, many of them. They have a disproportionate need for special education services, but that need is not always identified, so they may not have an IEP. And then more than 2/3 nationally drop out after release from the juvenile justice system, and I actually read a statistic in the last couple of days that even those who re-enroll after placement, graduation rate, I saw one study suggesting was 2%. So basically, very huge portion of the kids in the juvenile justice system just not making it through high school. So barriers, I think we've gone over, and I think we heard really so articulately from the youth who spoke, but a lack of stability for both youth in child welfare and juvenile justice system, delays with enrollment, problems with record transfers. We hear the kid who will go, this is an example from my state of Pennsylvania, but kid who went to school, took a health class. They did that health class where you take home the pretend baby and you have to care for it as part of learning. So took home a pretend baby, switched schools, got in the same health class, took home another pretend baby, 3 pretend babies later, and at the end, you know, our kids are getting frustrated and not feeling like it's worth it to keep trying to make it to that diploma. So these are some of the overarching points that we want to go through of things that seem to make a difference for kids in both systems. To counterbalance the problems with instability, obviously keeping kids in school and ideally in the same school whenever possible. And we put engagement there. We heard earlier from some of the youth about extracurricular. We thought a lot of youth say that's the thing that kept me in school. It wasn't my classes, it was my football team, it was my Dungeons and Dragons club. Having a point of contact. So, and I heard there's some of this going on and some new exciting movement in the legislature about having liaisons to help kids in the child welfare system. And I also heard some examples earlier today in conversation about using Title I Part D funds for transition coordinators for youth in the juvenile justice system. So when they're making that tricky transition from placement back into the community, there's an adult to help them do that. And then the court role is obviously vital for both. I don't need to belabor that, but we'll go into some good legislative examples later. The crucial need for data in both systems so that we know what's happening with our kids, we can track what's working, we can track what isn't working, and collaboration. How are we going to work together? It's actually been really great to hear about the collaboration that's already happening here. And one of the things I think Kathy actually has taught me over the years is these are such good opportunities for us to hear examples of exciting work that we will be hopefully able to share around the country. And definitely the collaboration in this room has been very positive.
That's a perfect transition. Before we move on to the next slides, I think, you know, we up there we listed some of the barriers that we commonly see, and we're talking about the themes that we think to pull out to sort of guide this conversation. But I just want to open it up. Does anybody have any barriers we didn't list on that slide that you think are something you're really facing as a leading challenge here in Iowa or in your local jurisdiction, and any focal points that we haven't listed out there? Maybe flip through the back couple slides so folks can remember. Do we have it, or are we missing a few? Yeah, please. So how to smooth transitions in a way that complements high school completion, successful high school completion. Yeah, great. Other thoughts, additions?
Hi, I'm John from the Woodward Academy. You know, we've had these nice young guests here today. At least the population I work with are almost all their own worst enemies. And, you know, self-sabotage, and that is caring and empathizing as we can be. They have to do the heavy lifting, which I'm always reminding the students I work with.
Yeah, I mean, perhaps what you're saying is we have really some shining stars who come and speak to us, and very frequently that is the case. When we talk about young people, we see kids who've been very successful, but I think we're showing the numbers and identifying that certainly doesn't represent the majority of kids that we're working with, and some have very unique and significant challenges that we have, as professionals, have to know how to work with them so that they can achieve to their highest potential. I think that's important. Jessica?
I was recently meeting with another youth group, and this issue came up, and one of them made a comment that I thought was really good, which is we need a chance to fail and fail and fail again and fail again, and then maybe, you know, we have no guarantees, but maybe at the end of that we'll be able to succeed. And we see other kids who are not system involved, they're messing up. Now, obviously, they're not dealing often with the same level of challenges. They're messing up too, and they have that opportunity. So I think there's some interesting work going on around the country about developmentally appropriate responses, especially to our older youth, so that we can give them a chance to fail but still be there repeatedly. I guess I said I would share, so I'll share.
I'm like crying at you. I was just going to say that I think you know, it's a very important point that often in our focus on what we're doing while kids are involved in our systems is that often kids are entering our systems dramatically behind educationally. And so making sure that frame, and educators are well aware of that because they've been working them before and during their involvement. And so how to focus on their unique needs, and often it's with deficits coming into the system. What we certainly, and I think a big message of our project is, what we don't want to see is adding to those deficits while they're in the system. And not only do we want to make sure we're not, you know, at least do no harm, but we actually want to see if we can't move kids forward in their educational trajectories.
I was just going to say, I live in a very mobile community, and a lot of our kids have a tremendous amount of school instability and mobility before we ever meet them. Not just within our community, but even across state lines. So.
The developmentally appropriate policies I was thinking of were, I think there was recent legislation that passed in Florida where some of it is as simple as figuring out that you can give a little bit more leeway in who drives a kid from one place to the other, because we need to be protective, but they have to have a chance to act like a kid as well. It's like we've got like some kind of a square dance going on. It's click the PowerPoint, talk in the mic, hand the mic, click the PowerPoint.
We're going to perfect this by the end of this hour and 45 minutes. So I'm going to walk you through a little bit. You know, when I was here in 2008, I distinctly remember, I don't know how many of you might, that we had just released what we consider sort of the cornerstone publication of our project, and it was called, what we named, and I know there's a lot of blueprints out there, but this is yet another one. We named it the Blueprint for Change, Educational Success for Children in Foster Care. And it was really the culmination of about the first year of our project. We brought together stakeholder groups and representatives from a whole host of jurisdictions, national organizations, folks focusing on specifically with youth, with parents, with on the child welfare side, on the education side, lawyers, judges, to really come up with what we consider a framework of what are we talking about when we say we want children to succeed educationally? What does that really mean? What are those goals for kids? And what we did was we came up with 8 leading goals and then about 56 accompanying benchmarks. that really were those indicators that if you were able to really achieve this for young people in foster care, and quite frankly, you know, many of the same goals and benchmarks are equally true of the juvenile justice population as well. If you're able to achieve this, these kids are going to have a strong likelihood of being on the right trajectory for success. Another big part of what we do with this publication that's now something that's linked to the database that I was talking about earlier is that we're constantly trying to collect examples from the field for each of these different goals and benchmarks of where somebody's creating something that's working, has either created a tool, whether it's a piece of legislation, whether it's a resource guide, and really make those available to folks. So I want to just walk you through or just have you see the goals 1 through 8. It's pretty comprehensive, and it's designed to be. So, you know, we've spent a lot of time, and we're going to talk a little bit more about this concept of stability, educational stability, and that really encompasses that first goals 1 and 2, that kids can stay in the same school whenever it's feasible. And then when changes do need to occur, that they happen as seamlessly as possible, that we really focus on what supports need to be put in place to make those transitions have the least amount of impact on young people. We also included goal 3, and I think sometimes when we talk about educational needs of kids in care, we immediately start and our minds go to school-aged children. And really, we thought it was really important that when we think of the full continuum of educational success, that we do not leave out our birth to 5 population and thinking about all of those things that need to be put in place so that young children are entering school ready to learn. And we do know from the data that there's a large number of children, 0 to 5, in the foster care system, and a good number of those are behind. They have deficits, developmental delays, and issues that are not making them ready to enter school on the same page as some of their other student peers. Goal 4, I think, is a really important one as well. It encompasses the full school experience. So we're talking about academic success for sure. Certainly, we're talking about being on track for high school completion. We're talking about academics, rigor, and strengths. But we're also talking about those things. We heard quite a bit of it actually this morning about sort of the non-academic side of the full school experience. That we make sure in our focus on standardized test scores and GPAs and on-time graduation, that we don't forget that critical piece of extracurricular activities, the things that make a school experience what it is. I just frequently say, you know, my fondest memory, I was a good student, but my fondest memories of high school wasn't math class. It just wasn't. It was all of the personal connections, maybe connections with teachers, connections with friends, the extracurricular activities that I participated in. The education was a bonus, and it was maybe one of the drivers that got me to school every morning. And so I think we have to be realistic when we think about expecting academic success if we take all those other pieces of the academic experience away. A big part of today is going to be focusing on issues that we hit on in Goal 5, this idea of dropout issues, truancy issues, and in particular disciplinary issues. And Jessica's going to take quite a bit of time to talk about that. I think they are, you know, 3 of the leading causes. Kids are in the foster care system and the juvenile justice system. We see far higher rates of all 3 for kids who are court involved. Goal 6 is really important. It's about involving and empowering youth in their education planning, in their education story. How often and how early are we talking with kids about what their interests are, what makes them excited, what makes them want to go to school and learn, all the way through educational planning as they're in middle school, and how early are we talking about? How early are we talking about post-secondary education? You know, when do we do that for kids of our own? And should it be any different? I remember when my daughter was in kindergarten, and she said, first I go to kindergarten, and then I go to college. And I thought there were 2 interesting things there, right? Number 1, as a 5-year-old, she had completely left out for her 1st to 12th grade. That was interesting. But that she already knew the concept of college, and I don't think anything happened. You don't consciously do something. It's something she's grown up with, and making sure we are providing that same environment for all of our young people in care. Supportive adults and advocates. This one is just so so huge for our kids, right? Making sure that there's someone who's got their back, whether it be that point person in the school who's going to guide them through the complexities of making sure you have the right documentation if you've moved schools, to navigating how this school building works differently than the one you came from, to really when a young person needs some of that external advocacy. How about the disciplinary action where the kid really does something wrong? I mean, what happens, when you as a parent get a call about your kid at school that there's been something that happens? Chances are a lot of people in this room would be at that school's door, at 7 a.m. the next morning, getting to the bottom of it. And do we have that same kind of rigor in our advocacy for our court-involved kids? That's what we need, somebody who's going to stand up for them, try to mitigate, and try to really work out a solution that's going to have positive impact. Decision makers, education decision making is a huge one. And we talked a lot, we heard Shay this morning talking a lot about family engagement and family involvement. Just because kids are court involved doesn't mean that goes away, right? We have to continue to engage, work with our families. What did we say? 68% of kids in the state are going back home. So how do we keep families engaged? How do we actually help and improve their ability to be strong educational advocates during the time that they're involved with the system, and really empower them for when reunification occurs, that they really have some additional skills they didn't have before. And then finally, goal 8 is moving beyond high school and whatever those post-secondary opportunities are, whether it's 2-year, 4-year, trade school, what are the long-term goals beyond high school? Oh, still me. Sometimes I like hearing Jessica talk. Okay, so I think the one last thing I'll say about the full gamut of the blueprint, it's dense and it's important, but that's really what we mean, right? That's really what we're all striving for. One of the things I think you're in a great place today is what I heard after lunch from your commissioners and from your judicial leaders. And I heard a pretty clear charge that didn't say we're focusing on all of this. I mean, we're all focused on all of this. But there has to be a piece where we have to say, what are we prioritizing right now? What are our immediate next priorities? And I heard 3 loud and clear. I heard data and information sharing, very clear. We're going to spend some time later talking about those issues. We heard academic success. And that was both sort of using as benchmarks, sort of that 3rd grade reading trigger, our kids on track, as well as high school completion. And then we heard the focus and attention on decreasing the number of out-of-school time, suspensions, expulsions, school-based arrests. I think those are, you can weave a lot of what we just talked about, the blueprint, into those 3 priority frameworks. And I think that's going to be your challenge, both at your local levels and as well as the state group that's continue to talk about these issues, is you have a charge from your leadership that those are your priorities. What are going to be those next steps and those next things that you could do to make some good steps? So another part, so the 2 things I think that Jessica and I have really been asked here to talk about is to do sort of some quick reminders about some of the legal framework that's out there, particularly some of the federal laws that help guide us, and that really can be used as advocacy tools for all of you. I think some of this will just be refresher. If it's new, wonderful. And then it's really about sharing with you as many as examples as we have time for about things that other jurisdictions are doing and what's working, or in some cases what they're struggling with in other jurisdictions. So that's really the goal of a big part of the rest of the presentation. I want to start out by talking about fostering connections to success. Is there anybody in the room who hasn't heard about fostering connections? Is that a new law for anyone? Couple of people shaking heads. For most of you, I think you're aware of it. So in 2008, was a pretty interesting time in Washington, D.C. If you might remember, we were in the midst of a fairly contested presidential election. Seems like that's what we're always in. And there wasn't a whole lot happening on Capitol Hill. There wasn't a whole lot of folks getting along. and not a whole lot of bills passing. And it really was what some people called a little bit of a small miracle, that a pretty comprehensive child welfare federal package was able to move through with bipartisan support. And it was called the Fostering Connections to Success Increasing Adoptions Act. Had a lot of different components. It had a lot of different pieces related to kinship and guardianship. It spoke to health care services. It talked to older youth issues, supports for tribal youth. But the piece we're talking about today is really, for one of the first times, it had some very comprehensive and specific language about education and what the expectation on this part of child welfare to work collaboratively with education partners to achieve educational stability for kids. So first and foremost, it talked about that the case plan that child welfare workers are required to maintain when kids are in care. They have to have assurances that placement of the child in foster care takes into account the appropriateness of the current education setting and the proximity to the school in which the child is enrolled at the time of placement. So, you know, the truth is that piece about proximity to the school at the time of placement actually existed in federal law for a long time before Fostering Connections. But because Fostering Connections brought with it a lot of attention, I think this provision got sort of re-shined upon, and really folks understood that that's always been part of good case planning. All of our child welfare folks in the room know that you know, that keeping kids placed and living closer to their school placements is really something that our agencies are going to strive to do whenever possible. The appropriateness of the current education setting, I think really, in my view, set a really important charge. And it wasn't just, I think that kids needed to be enrolled in school. They needed to be enrolled in the right school setting and the right school placement. There is a qualitative piece to that. It has to be an appropriate place for them to get an education. Child welfare agencies must coordinate with schools to ensure children remain in their same schools unless it's not in the child's best interest. And so really it's a shift in how we think. It shifted the presumption that kids stay in their school unless it's not best for them to do so. Child welfare agencies, there was a piece to the federal law that spoke to the availability for some kids, for some partial recoupment using a federal reimbursement match for a piece of the cost of transportation for some kids in the child welfare system. So that did not solve the transportation question. It's still a big question. I'm sure you all can tell me stories about how it continues to be a question. But it was a small piece of the puzzle, and it did move us a little step further in terms of addressing transportation issues. And then it talked about if that best, sure, go ahead. Well, foster. Mm-hmm. No, I mean, I think Fostering Connections is really talking about school-age kids. Jessica, yeah. You mean if a younger child is, you mean when younger kids are accessing like an early childhood program, do you mean? Yeah. I think it's an interesting question. I don't think it's something that's been fully resolved, quite honestly, at the federal level. It didn't say it didn't apply, I think, but there hasn't been a whole lot of guidance talking about how you achieve school stability when it's an early care and education setting or a Head Start program. Certainly the same philosophy is true, the same circumstances are true, but how Fostering Connections specifically weighs in. It talks specifically about working with your local education agencies, and in not every state is the local education agency the responsible entity for that early childhood program. I think if your local education agency is the responsible entity, then I think it's something you could engage in conversations about how to make some of these provisions apply. Other questions on that? Yes. Yeah, great question. So I think really, really at the heart of fostering connections is that the very piece of how do you make that best interest decision, right? It's about making a qualitative, child-specific decision, thinking of all the different factors that are possible, but really having it be specific to that child's needs and circumstances. That's really, really, really key and important to making sure the efforts we're making to keep kids, we're making for the right kids. But there wasn't directly in the statute. Now, what did come out in July of 2010 was some guidance at the federal level that gave us the beginning of some of those, some thoughts of what kind of issues needed to be factors to consider in that best interest decision. Safety of the child, of course. We're going to consider whether it would be safe for the child to remain in that school. You know, we've developed some resources and some checklists and some templates looking at sort of making those quality best interest decisions. Do you have a state version of that, Doug? A best interest sort of checklist or resource?
In the transportation brief that was put out last year,
Yeah.
we did address the, thank you. In the transportation brief that Department of Human Services and Department of Education released last year, we did address the best interest determination and basically just followed from that guidance, maybe added one or two other things, but it addressed it challenged the case manager, because this Fostering Connections really looks to the DHS to initiate this conversation. It really looked to the case manager and provided them guidance to say, okay, you're going to need to engage your team. We use family team decision-making meetings and other venues to bring the folks to the table, the parent, the child, the guardian ad litem, and others, to have that discussion and then consider those things like, okay, where does the child want to go? Where does the parent want the child to go? Where are they going to be safe? Are there any behavioral issues that need to be mitigated? Are there any bridges burnt that can't be overcome? Are there services needed? That kind of thing.
You know, yeah, that's a great list. You know, we hear a lot, you know, how long the commute is, you know, length of commute. It certainly is something that has to be considered, but the way that factor is considered, if you're talking a 5-year-old kindergartner, might be very different than if you're talking about a 17-year-old senior. And so that's why it's not one factor alone that makes those decisions, but it's the complete, a complete picture for that particular student. So I think that's really key. When it's determined not to be best interest, so we talked a lot about if it's determined it's in the best interest, that kids remain. If it's determined not to be in the best interest, what happens? And what the law says is child welfare agencies work, coordinate with their school partners again to ensure immediate and appropriate enrollment, you know, in a new school, you know, with all the educational records of the child provided to that school. And I think that's just really critical to remember. You know, it is a presumption shift that kids stay, but it's not, you know, when we say we're going to look at data and track data, I'd be really, really suspect, quite frankly, of a jurisdiction that said 100% of the kids remained in their same school, because it's not a one-size-fits-all. There's going to be circumstances and situations where school changes, it needs to be right. So what data point are we looking for? What's the right combination? I don't know. But I think we just have to look really closely. When we see, you know, when we hear young people and what was the total, 22 schools among them, that's alarming to me. That's where we start to say, I don't think best interest decisions were really made each and every time. And for many of them, it was before the law was passed. Okay. So I think I'm not going to go through, hold on just one second. I'm not going to go through each of these. You have these in your materials, but it's just a lot of the different things you can look at. You know, what's going on at the agency level related to identifying placements that keep kids closer. How do we stabilize living placements, minimize this disruption? The easiest way to not have these complexities around school mobility is if we can keep kids' placements more stable, or when placements change, keep them in the same school district, and you avoid a lot of the complexities that we're talking about. The best interest decisions we've already talked about. You know, transportation issues, that is something at the local level and at the state level that you're going to continue to have to engage in conversations about. But it is a critical piece. You know, how to make sure when re-enrollments are happening, that they're happening timely, those records are following. You've got some good new state law that we're going to hear about tomorrow that helps you with that. You know, and there's a lot of sort of secondary questions that I think Fostering Connections brings up. One of them, the piece about what about young children and how do we keep their early educational experiences more stable? That's a great one that but and what else are their unique needs of the youngest kids? The trauma-informed piece, how do we make sure that in doing all of this, that all of the entities are informed about the trauma experiences that our kids have had? How do we make sure the educational setting is trauma-informed? How do we make sure the court setting is trauma-informed? How do we make sure that the team meetings going on child welfare are continued to be guided in that way? Special education, I've already heard a couple of questions in the conversations and our examples. One of the things we're starting to hear more questions about is, there's Fostering Connections and sort of that school mobility piece, but it's layered, right? When you have a child who also is eligible under IDEA for special ed services and maybe transportation is written into their IEP, so how does that transportation piece overlap with the McKinney-Vento, with Fostering Connections piece? It can become it's pretty important to really understand the nuances of the different legal parameters. Keep going. I'm going to mention just McKinney-Vento very briefly. Anybody in the room not heard of McKinney-Vento Act? Yeah, so I think most of you probably do know, and certainly for educators, it is it's part of, it was reauthorized as part of the Elementary Secondary Education Act, which passed in 2002. It specifically speaks to children who meet a particular definition of a homeless child and youth, and it really provides some similar type interventions that we just talked about under Fostering Connections, kids having a right to remain in a school, immediate enrollment in a new school if that's best, and has a strong support of transportation on the part of education. So the real question becomes who meets that eligibility? Certainly kids who are experiencing homelessness, but do any of our court-involved kids ever sort of overlap and meet that definition? And that's going to vary widely by state, but I think it's important to know that one of the terminologies that's included in the definition is that awaiting foster care placement, and just know to really think about which kids court-involved does that really apply to. I gave you the sort of the federal framework around school stability in some of these pieces. Remembering that there's a lot of states that have been passing some great legislation, including your own. And so we maintain sort of a chart around some of these key provisions, of which we just 2 weeks ago added Iowa's new bill that passed. But I think it's really important to know, and I heard some talk of, what was it, 7 a.m. that your session ended, and we're already looking towards your next legislative session. So there are a lot of other states that have passed some similar bills, and there might be, as you think about what's next and what are the next steps and gains around some of these issues, to look to what some of the other states are doing. There were states talking about these issues before Fostering Connections passed. States like California and Washington State had school stability legislation on the books, and then many more passed since 2008. So there's a lot of examples to choose from. Okay, now I can stop talking and turn it over to Jessica to walk us through some great JJ pieces.
Great. And if you're one of the people who likes to follow along with your PowerPoint, you may have already figured out that late in the middle of the night last night, we suddenly decided it was very important to delete 3 slides and move 2 other ones over. So this will just be a little cognitive challenge for you at this time in the afternoon. But we want to shift gears now and talk a little bit about, and we actually put here youth and the juvenile justice system. That may not have been in the earlier version, but it's actually important because partly we want to talk about how to keep kids out of the juvenile justice system. And so what are those educational practices that can help kids in school in a positive way? One way to think about it is at the points of intervention. So the first point of intervention is what can we do that's positive in the school that can support kids, particularly kids who are dealing with trauma. The second one is next the kid, it doesn't work out. Our first strategy about addressing things in the school doesn't work. The kid ends up in front of a juvenile court judge. What are some court responses that we see around the country that may help to push those kids back into a positive environment in the school? We heard this morning about the tickets that they're doing in Florida, some other examples like that. And then third, for those youth who do end up in a juvenile justice placement, how do we facilitate reentry so that they can stay on track? So first, creating a positive school climate, whereas everyone, they were expelled. This is obviously not what we were envisioning, but this is a real issue that we, in the last number of years, have relied increasingly on zero tolerance strategies that seemed good on paper, but I think that many educators and parents and others are finding don't work as well in practice because we need to have a more individualized response to our kids. So just a show of hands, I know there were a bunch of educators in the room. How many have used either school-wide positive behavioral supports, or restorative justice, or trauma-informed curriculum? Great. So that's quite a number of you. And I am not an expert in the practices. What I did is go through the laws across the jurisdictions and look for policies that looked good. What did people put into state policy that sounded like it would help kids to stay in school and get the supports they need? And some of them referred back to these practices. So I know probably just enough to understand what those laws have done, and you all can fill in the gaps. So starting with school-wide positive behavioral supports, this is an intervention that I think the results have been very dramatic. You see here discipline referral rates reduced by 50 to 60%, so a lot less discipline problems. Reduction also in fighting, in-school suspension, classroom disruption, but also at the same time increased academic engagement and increased academic performance. And one of the interesting things is that increased academic performance was not only for those kids who are struggling and more likely to have disciplinary issues, but for all kids, presumably because there's less chaos and nonsense, and so everyone can get more done. This is my, further very basic understanding, but essentially just to give those of you who don't work in education a sense of what it is. There's a primary prevention, which is you're creating a culture across the school about how to teach kids positive social interactions. And the little kids can be, I'm catching you being good, as opposed to I'm constantly saying you're doing something wrong. But those are systematically used across the school, so it's not just one teacher's sort of isolated effort in a classroom. Secondary prevention would be a specialized group for kids with a higher risk, and then at the top, that's specialized individuals. So there are some kids who are dealing with, I think someone mentioned earlier, where we have kids who are dealing with really serious trauma and other challenges who really need individual interventions. These are some of the elements. I won't go through all of them, but establishing clear positive expectations and really using data-based decision making. So you're tracking what's happening and where you have trouble spots. Or is there a place in your school where things are going wrong all the time? Is there a time in your school where things are going wrong? What is it that's triggering it, and how do you think of another way of approaching it? So that's the school-wide positive. Some people say supports, some people say interventions and supports. Another set of practices have been coming around that are trauma-informed practices. If you assume that one of the things that's happening with a kid, for example, a kid getting in a fight at school, is that they've gotten into that fight or flight mode and they're stuck and everything seems like a threat to them because of their trauma history. There are some folks who have done a lot of good work on how do you intervene. And so, again, some of these interventions are simple, some of them are a little bit more complicated, but some of them are as easy as changing the type of conversation we have with kids when they start to escalate or get into a fight, to ask them how they're doing, to ask them if they feel safe, to help them create a safety plan. So simple things that you can do systematically that de-escalate violence. And these are just two good resources from Massachusetts. They've done a lot of work both thinking about what it looks like for a school to be trauma-informed and then how to embed that in state policy. And restorative justice, is anyone using restorative justice practices here? There are a lot of different practices that are called restorative justice practices, but the concept would be that you're bringing together what we call it here, the offender, the victim, and the community. So in the school context, a kid gets into a fight, you might bring both of those kids together, you may bring a class together, and have everyone in a facilitated conversation where everyone has a chance to be heard. And some of the schools that have done this, they have circles and they meet in their circles and they're able to teach a different kind of decision making, so that, and they find that over time, same kind of things that we've seen with some of these other interventions, just the level of fighting the disciplinary infraction starts to go down. I think I'm ready for the next one. Okay, so I wanted to shift from these are some of the practices that are out there to, is there any law, or how do you embed this at a wider level? And I just wanted to flag new guidance from the department, the U.S. Department of Education. How many folks have heard of this new guidance coming out? Okay, so a few. It's very recent, and it's helpful for a number of reasons. First of all, the kind of practices that I was just describing, the Department of Education is really recommending that schools and school districts around the country start using these and start using them more regularly. I've listed here some of the bullet points of what the guidance goes over. You can find it. I really should have put the website, but if you just Google guidance on school discipline, Department of Education, you'll get it as your first hit. But the other thing that the guidance does is have a ton of resources. So they've compiled state statutes, state policies on discipline and promising practices. They've also compiled incredible trainings, tools, guides, webinars, pretty much any kind of resource that they could find. They just did a big environmental scan and found everything and dumped it in one place, so that if you're in a school and thinking about what can we do to build up our positive discipline interventions, this is a really good resource. I will add that they have a little bit of attention to kids going into the justice system and back, and recognize the importance of reentry and supports at reentry. But also a lot of these practices that work in schools can be adapted to juvenile facilities. Okay. So what I'm going to do now is just try to take you through, and this is not comprehensive at all, but some of the interesting policies that when we sat down and just poured through the statutes from all around the country, we found that try to embed these promising ideas into policy. So Indiana, requiring evidence-based responses to behavior and discipline. Illinois, establishing standards for social and emotional learning. So we have standards for, this is what you need to know in math. We also will say by by third grade, you will be able to articulate your problem with words and have a conversation with your fellow students. And if you actually look, and I need to add some of these links, but if you actually look online, you can get what those standards look like. So they've really fleshed out for each grade what their expectations are. Maryland decided to pick those schools with high disciplinary, that we're doing a lot of exclusionary school discipline, so a lot of suspensions and expulsions, and say, if this is happening in your school, you need to use school-wide positive behavioral supports or another positive intervention. I don't think they didn't want to use a certain model, but they did want to make sure that they're using a positive intervention. And then Massachusetts, those two reports I referred to earlier, incentivizing trauma-informed schools. They did some block grants so that schools could get some of the financial support they would need to really think about how they're responding to kids who have been highly traumatized. Okay, so step one was trying to create a positive school climate. Step two is things are still not going well. How do we handle exclusionary discipline? And there's some new, and this is a sort of a fast evolving field, I would say. There's new legislation popping up around the country on it. So limiting suspensions and expulsions to serious offenses. We know around the country that kids are getting suspensions and expulsions for carrying a cell phone or wearing the wrong uniform, or the good one is either being tardy or absent truant from school, and then you get suspended with your out-of-school suspension. So some things like that we may want to just think about and put them in policy so it doesn't happen. Permitting referrals to law enforcement only for fights involving weapons. So this is Tennessee, was thinking, even some fights, there have always been fights in schools. We don't like them, but maybe there's a way to handle them in the school. And when they get more serious, that's when it's appropriate for a law enforcement referral. Requiring individualized responses. I think these are really reactions to zero tolerance policies. So recognizing that kids' situations actually matter, and that while we need to have some clarity of expectations for youth, they want to take into account what the individual youth situation, what would be best for the kid and the class and the school. Okay, I don't know if you can see the top there, the role of the courts. It says decisions, decisions, decisions. But the question, of course, in this context is what are those decisions and how does state policy help? So New Hampshire engages the courts in brokering multi-stakeholder solutions. So this is the idea that judges can be excellent conveners, that the rest of us generally respond when they ask us to do something, and that they can use that power for good by bringing us all together to figure out what's happening in school. So those of you who are judges, that's my plea. So this is an interesting one in Connecticut that said, we're going to give judges more discretion to suspend a delinquency proceeding entirely and push something back to the school for the kid to participate in a school-based violence prevention program. So it's not that we're ignoring the behavior, we're expecting accountability, but we think maybe the juvenile justice system isn't the best place. And then other places, and I think Shay talked about this a little bit this morning, but prioritizing community-based treatment instead of secure placement whenever possible. Okay, and then for those kids who do end up in the juvenile justice system, we talked a little bit earlier about the poor statistics on kids returning to school. Actually, we had a lawsuit in Philadelphia because our kids were being barred by city policy from returning to school. They were only allowed to go into our alternative education, which is fewer hours. And the court actually held that was a violation of due process, and they at least had to have a hearing to determine whether there was a reason, a security-based reason to keep them out of school. But we can do better than that. One of the issues with re-entry is when kids don't get the kind of education they need when they're in placement. And so some states have addressed this. Maine here, holding facility education to the same standards as all schools. So when you go into placement, you're expected to do what any 10th grader would be expected to do. Requiring individualized education plans for youth entering placement. I think someone was mentioning earlier that this is a problem when kids are having these frequent transitions. To what degree can creating an individualized education plan help? And this is not just the IEP under special ed. And then requiring judges to address educational needs at each hearing. We have court rules in Pennsylvania that require judges to ask about make inquiries and issue findings about academic progress, about special education needs, about school stability for kids in the foster care system, and about education decision makers to make sure that there is someone in each kid's life able to make those decisions. And then the last one was use Title I Part D. It's a vague, for those of you who work with it, it's a fairly vague law, but it provides money for juvenile justice education. And so it's being strategic about how you use that money. Folks have used it really effectively for transition planning, which doesn't have, someone else was making this point earlier, which is generally a harder thing to find funding for. So find some of those pockets where you can make the most use of that kind of funding. Once you've gotten this great quality of education in the juvenile justice facility, there's still an issue around the transition. Kids need to get back. We have in Pennsylvania 500 school districts, and they each have their own curriculum. I understand you have over 300 here. So it's going to be challenging sometimes to keep a kid on track who's not in one place. Transition coordinators can be really helpful with that. Transition teams can be really helpful with that. And so these are a few examples of states that have embedded that in statute. But it's not just the probation or court that needs to focus on the reentry. The school also needs to be ready to re-enroll in a positive way. So Virginia said the homeschool has to maintain, oh here, I won't do it by state, you can see the state, but some of the things that schools are required to do under state law in various places are maintain records, accept full and partial credits. A lot of kids get stuck on that partial, you know, a half a semester and a half a semester and a half, and it never adds up to the full semester. Then they fall further behind. Maine has a really interesting one, convening a reintegration team. So there's a team in the school focused on figuring out how to get the kid fully involved again. Virginia sets timelines on re-enrollment. And then Virginia also prohibits the homeschool from suspending or expelling a student for the underlying offense. So you can't just go back to school after having your time in the juvenile justice facility and be suspended for what you've already served your time for doing. So here's my cute little chickie. The bottom line here is there are a lot of policies looking at over the last years that have looked at school exclusion and zero tolerance, but when you start to think about school inclusion, it can make a real difference for our kids.
So how many Lucys do we have in the room? Yes, exactly. Jessica and I should both be raising our hands after our dinner conversation last night. So it's tough, right? It's tough. You're juggling a lot. You're each in your individual agencies. We've got strong, clear requirements in our individual jobs, and sometimes it feels like you're at it alone and you don't have partners. I think obviously there are things that we individually as courts, as agencies need to do when we think about this, but the key of collaboration and really why we should be excited about collaboration is it's really designed to make our lives easier, right? It's much easier to tackle some of these large systemic problems when we're not doing it just us, because the impact of just us isn't always going to be as powerful as when we do it as, the courts in Iowa and Department of Education and Child Welfare all coming together and moving forward on something. You're going to see the impact of that a lot clearer. It's really key for collaboration to remember all the different players, and we've talked about this, and many of you are here in the room, but there is a role for every single stakeholder constituent to play in ensuring educational success for kids, and a big part of the challenge is to really identify what those are, what specific actions and what specific things we need to take a look at. I think some of this I honestly don't think the people in this room need, because it's what you've been engaged in and what you're doing right now. But thinking about why you're coming together, how to increase the attention. You've got, I love coming to states and to meetings like this where we already have a strong education presence in the room. I would say the big difference to 10 years ago, I'd come in the courts and child welfare, and they didn't know. They just didn't know how to talk to their education partners and get them there. And now we're seeing some real benefits that they're here and suddenly realizing, hey, we're all working towards the same goals for some of our kids. The key of the leadership piece, I really can't tell you how happy you all should be at the kickoff of this afternoon. I mean, I think that's important to have your commissioners here, to have your court leadership here saying, this is important, we need to focus on this, we're committed to it. You're in a great place to start moving things even further forward. I think, one of the biggest challenges, you can go to the next one, I think one of the biggest challenges sometimes is thinking about what we need to do individually and what we need to do collaboratively and sort of setting those parameters. One of the things I talk about, creating common knowledge base. It's really why you have these kind of education summits, right? Is to have all the different groups hearing some of the same pieces and some of the same strategies. But it's also trying to set some clear goals, short and long term, individual to your entities, as well as what you need to do collaboratively. So we said here, revising your policies, your procedures, really looking at the practice of this and how it's playing out on the ground. I can't tell you how many places I've come to, working with a group at the state level, and they say, look at our policy, it's perfect, we got it perfect. And I start talking to the advocates in the state, and they're like, it's not working, it's just not working. It's not necessarily that the policy isn't great, it's just not playing out on the ground. And so making sure your policy and practice connections are really in place. I think the structure and a process to how to continue collaboration, I think that's another place where I was hearing some really good things coming out of some of the conversations that have happened here in the state over the next few weeks. We're talking about that, your state council and the Children's Justice Commission really being the ones that are going to help lead this and having those leaderships there, creating some clear accountability to move some of these priority areas forward here. Maintaining the communication and the momentum. I think this is a perfect place to sort of think about that. I'm looking over at Doug and Susan and thinking about being here in 2008 and realizing that that was actually 6 years ago. It's tough to keep it moving, right? There's times when, you know, politics and leadership change and, you know, the other latest key issue that everybody pulls you away from, but how to continue to keep this on the radar screen when there's so many other competing issues. So, but it's the key to the successful collaboration. So we're going to just walk you through. You know, we're getting a little bit late in the afternoon. I can talk about a bunch of these, and you know, again, we have them organized, sort of some that are being led a little bit from the child welfare side, some from the courts, some from education, some that are truly, you know, collaboratively led. And why don't we go ahead and cycle through them. You know, Jessica, being in Pennsylvania, talked a lot about some of the really great tools and resources, and it was really coming out of the DPW, Department of Public Welfare in Pennsylvania, and where they really had created some screening tools for their workers to use to really be able to issue spot when there's a significant educational issue. The county agency, the state agency required every county agency in Pennsylvania to identify a liaison on the child welfare side, so a point person to work with the districts. Now, as Jessica just mentioned, it becomes tricky. You talk to those liaisons, and there are, what'd you say? 500 school districts, so each one of those liaisons has to connect with a large number of districts, as I know you can experience here too, and so there still are challenges, but at least you're embedding some level of extra expertise within the different organizations, and of course those judicial rules that have that Pennsylvania has developed and put out. I think that's really important to guiding sort of the court's view on and the court's role in reviewing and heightening the scrutiny of education outcomes. Another campaign I thought was really important was one that Florida did several years ago. They called it Everybody's a Teacher, and they created, and it was a state level, it was really a campaign, and the Child Welfare Agency created video spots, and they got sort of the leadership in the state to do sort of short videos, and it was where they just cycled through, and I'm a teacher, I'm a teacher, I'm a teacher, right? Everybody from the judges to the foster parents to the kids in schools they created, but it was basically a template for a local jurisdiction to basically take this. It was almost a backpack of resources that they created at the state level and really implement almost like a regional roundtable where they were sort of shining the light on education and getting folks to really think about how to collaborate and how to bring all the right people to the table. There's a big piece, and it's continuing in Florida, and there's a big piece on Florida's Child Welfare's website where you can get a lot of the different resources that were created through that campaign. You know, another piece we talk about, and I keep it in, we've been talking about it for a long time, but when we're able to decrease how far kids are moved, we're going to really help decrease the amount of mobility or complex mobility issues we have to come up with solutions for. And so more and more we're hearing about folks using the technology that's out there, mapping out not just where the children are being removed compared with where the foster home resources are, but really embedding over that this school boundary map and educating yourselves, not just keeping kids living closer to where they're removed, but also thinking in lines of, where those boundaries are. You've got other jurisdictions where they do a tremendous job at communicating about where not just school boundaries, but thinking about where transportation would work. If you move from this part of the region and you move them further north, we actually have some transportation options that way. But if you move them east, we've got nothing. We've got nothing. And making sure that kind of detailed of information is being communicated. I think the other really cool thing I've seen in jurisdictions is as we've improved the school and child welfare relationship, that, you know, it's not the natural, well, it's not the first thing you're thinking of when you're saying we want to have better collaboration, but it's amazing how the folks in schools happen to be folks that really like to devote themselves to kids. And you're finding resource families through the PTA and through school staff and through teachers and coaches, and they're becoming school-based recruitment and thinking, and schools saying, hey, we have 2 kids who, you know, go to this school and we're looking for permanent families, and using the school community as a way to help brainstorm about placement resources. School transportation, I mean, there's a lot to this one, and we can certainly talk about it more tomorrow. You know, there are some great pockets of successes where we're seeing real collaborative funding. You know, folks coming together, and the district pools money and pooling money from the agency, and even courts being able to come together and having transportation funds to really address when kids do have some transportation costs associated with keeping them in their same school, that there's actually dollars there to do it. Jessica, you want to talk about these 2?
So the, now I'm way up here, just trying to keep things exciting. This is just a simple one in a way, but the Education Law Center, a nonprofit based in Pennsylvania, put together a toolkit that explained enough about education law for juvenile probation officers that allowed the probation officers to be education advocates. So when, for example, a kid was having trouble re-enrolling in school, they had information and ideas about what to do to ensure that enrollment, they knew what the timelines were. And they trained probation officers all around the state. It was a really successful and exciting look at collaboration in a different way.
Some of these we've already talked about. I don't know, has anybody ever seen the Endless Dreams video? It's out of Casey Family Programs Foundation in Washington State, and it's a video that it's also a full train-the-trainer curriculum, and it was specifically, it's been updated in 2010, I think, but it's a curriculum, a train-the-trainer curriculum specifically speaking to an education audience. So it's about 10 different modules, and a trainer comes out and I've seen it work at the state level where they send district representatives. I've seen it at the district level, particularly for a large school district where they send different, you know, the head of guidance counselors and the head of social workers, and then they become trained trainers about how to talk about foster care issues, how to talk about trauma-informed policies, how to talk about fostering connections, school stability. I mean, it covers the whole gamut of what educators might need to know about children involved in the child welfare system. And then there's sort of an action planning piece at the end of it where they can really say, okay, what can we do differently and how can we do it? What's cool about it is you come once, you get these trained trainers, and part of their action plan is, who am I going to take this to next? What's my plan for bringing this out and expanding the piece in the community? You know, we're going to talk about data in a minute, and I think it's a huge, huge overarching piece to everything we talk about is being able to track and measure. But the other huge piece we haven't talked as much about is training. Training, and how to embed it, and how to keep it current, and how to keep it constant. And here we come and we do an Ed Summit, and 2 years from now, you know, if you were to do this again, there'd be different people in the room. And think of all the people who aren't in the room. How do we get it down to the building level staff? And how do we get it down to all the frontline caseworkers? And how do we get it to our foster parents? You know, we have a lot of audiences that need to hear this. And so developing sort of that comprehensive training plan about how we're all going to be able to access the right information is really key too. Just on the other piece, you know, this concept of liaisons, we're going to talk about, well, I think there's another place for me to talk about that. We talked about the trauma-sensitive schools piece from Massachusetts. Another great one is the Compassionate Schools Initiatives out of Washington State. That's another really good one to take a look at. You know, not a program, but a process to cultivate a culture and climate that benefits all kids. I think one of the great things about these pieces is why they specifically speak to our kids, and it's something really powerful. You know, any school folks that you talk to say there is just a tremendous benefit to all the students in our school building. I think we can keep going. We talked about the court rules. Some really interesting pieces. I've been working with a jurisdiction in Cincinnati, Ohio, and they have a project there. They call it Kids in School Rule. And this project has really developed. There's been a local legal aid organization, as well as the juvenile court magistrate in Cincinnati, that's really taken the lead of working with Cincinnati public schools to ensure there's a, we talk about liaisons in the districts. There's a point person in every school building throughout Cincinnati Public. And they just have these great leaders in both agencies. They've got 2 ed specialists embedded within the child welfare agency. And so they've really got sort of that piece, the personnel resources. But on the school side, those 2 lead child welfare agency specialists are responsible for submitting a separate educational court report for every kid in this pilot. And it gives tremendous amount of detail about, school stability and what are their grades, and they attach details about if they've had attendance problems. They attach very detailed information about attendance issues, disciplinary issues, what's the planning going on, and it's a supplement to the general court report. And then the magistrates are basically using some tools to make sure that as they're reading this report, they're asking the right questions and they know what kind of things they can order based on that. So it's been a really I think an important piece to making sure that the court oversight process is really paying attention to what's going on too. Education decision makers, I think it's a huge, huge issue for our general ed kids, for our special ed kids. Who stands in the shoes of the parent to make legal ed decisions? You've got to know it. You've got to know it at every point of the case. You've got to know it for the kid's general ed. You have to know it if the child's special ed. It might be the parents, the birth parents might still hold those rights. You got to make sure you're engaged. And if they don't, if there's a reason for them not to, what's the process in your state and jurisdiction to limit that? And then who is going to hold those rights? You would never send your child to school and not have the school have an emergency phone number and know who to call if your child got injured or had to go to the emergency room. We cannot have schools have kids who are court involved who don't know who the ultimate legal person making legal decisions is. Another great initiative that I've been really involved with, it's been really exciting, is out of Texas, and their Texas Supreme Court has been leading, and it's now like 3 or 4 years in, and they have a tremendous person in their court improvement project who has just been leading this charge. Their Supreme Court justice there issued an order creating an education committee at the state level. In that order, she named names. She said, you, the head of Texas Education Agency, and you, the executive director of the Texas School Board Association, and you, the School Administrators Association, as well as a foster parent, judges, folks in the child welfare, said, we're going to sit for 2 years. 2 years they brought together over 100 people statewide, meetings, calls, identifying what they used was, they developed, talked about our blueprint. They created a Texas blueprint. This is what we need to change. And then their Supreme Court adopted the recommendations that they said about what they needed to see changed. And now for the last 1.5 years, they've been working really hard on implementing some of those changes. They've gotten tremendous legislative gains. They now have, the Texas Education Agency now has a tab. They can identify in their data system when kids are in foster care. They have a state law that requires liaisons in each school district. There's just a lot of great stuff coming out of Texas, given that heightened attention, and really the relationships they've built have been extraordinary. Do you want to talk about Georgia a little bit?
So in Clayton County, Georgia, Judge Teskey, when I was talking about the power of judges to convened police, law enforcement, social services, and the schools together to talk about their high rates of referrals from the schools to the juvenile justice system and to try to address it. And I actually want to read some of the statistics about what happened next. So basically, they came up with a cooperative agreement that said, we're not going to refer to the juvenile justice system misdemeanor delinquent acts like fighting, disrupting the public school, disorderly conduct, obstruction, unless it happens a bunch of times in one school year. Instead, we're going to give youth warnings, then we're going to do mediation, and also elementary school students can't be referred to law enforcement. And this is what happened next in the schools. The presence of dangerous weapons on campus decreased by 70%. Police officers say their relationships with students have improved. They had an 87% decrease in fighting, an 86% decrease in referrals for fighting and disruption of public offenses, specifically for African American youth, and their graduation rates increased by 20%. So it's kind of interesting because the reason we have zero tolerance policies and the reason we refer things is that we're trying to make our schools safer. So I just thought it was pretty stunning to hear the positive consequences that came when they thought about things a little bit differently.
Okay, and then we talked about, some of those are being led by one or the other agency, but there's just a lot of good stuff out there where it's truly been a collaborative group that has really said, let's roll up our sleeves and do this. Virginia, I think this is a really great example because the State Department of Education and the State Department of Social Services issued simultaneously, or joint, actually it was a single document, but it was joint, where they had really hammered through each of the policies, the process, what happens related to school stability, how many days child welfare has to notify the school, how many days the school is going to get the records. It was specific, it was clear who was responsible for what, it was messaged to both systems, the exact same information. There was a whole training protocol that went along with the release of the new policy. And they had the piece of liaisons, which is always so key. So, I hope you're listening to this, and I think maybe some of you might be saying, well, we're doing some of that, and I know you are, and I'm excited because that's going to be a big part of tomorrow is to hear all of you talk about the great initiatives that you're doing. Hopefully there's one of the two or things that we've talked about here today that maybe has sparked some thoughts in your head and might be something for us to talk further about tomorrow, even when you're talking in your smaller groups. And Jessica and I will be here all day and available. We talked a lot about liaisons. My only last point that I think we haven't hit is just remembering really what we're talking about is designating specific people in each entity that have this specialized knowledge and understanding, and it's so critical. We talk a lot about it in the education side, but I think it's equally important to think about on the child welfare side that we have designated people who really understand the education world, and even within the courts, there's some really good models of court-based liaisons, people who really can be a quick conduit for the judges to be able to access the education information, think about placement options, be there on an immediate basis. And so it's really in all systems that we think about. For tomorrow, we could. I think we could. I think that, we're running very close to the end of time. The only thing I'll say is that we'll talk more about data tomorrow. I think it's a huge piece of what you're going to want to be thinking about, no matter what you're identifying as your goals. Yeah, Jessica has really outdone herself with the addition of humor into this presentation. I love all of these. I think that my short message on data is remembering that we actually mean a bunch of different things when we're talking about data and information sharing. That we're talking at the core about student-specific information getting in the hands of the right people so that we can serve a particular child, a particular student in the right way. So that means education records flowing to the frontline caseworker so they're able to make their best interest decisions and do their job. It's about the specific information that schools need to be able to make sure they're keeping the child safe and their educational programs appropriate. So there's the student-specific level, and then there's a lot of the things that we're talking about in some of the data we're reporting, which is a little bit higher. It's sort of that aggregate level. It's how are our kids doing? How are the things we're doing making a difference? And I think that level of data sharing, sort of more at the system level, a little bit more on the accountability level, is equally important. And I think efforts where we've seen people being successful around data is when they have sort of simultaneously efforts going on for both of these. There was a law passed last year called the Uninterrupted Scholars Act, and it amended FERPA, the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, to make it very clear that child welfare caseworkers have an absolute right to access, or can have access to child welfare, to educational information when a child's in their custody. It kind of clarified a point that really should have been clarified decades ago, but it was really a very important step to really open the door to some of these data and information sharing conversations. So I think we'll table the rest of it for tomorrow, but just sort of be aware that Uninterpreted Scholars has really changed the landscape. Jessica's available to sort of talk about sort of the JJ component there too, and there's information in your materials. So I feel like we've talked really fast. Do you feel that way? Yes, please.
Okay, we already did our plug for the Legal Center. Please use our website. You can look things up by state. You can look things up by subject. You can also let us know as you keep doing great things, and we will post it for other people to see. And we are starting a list. We have a listserv. We're also starting a listserv out of Juvenile Law Center on juvenile justice education issues. And you know, the intelligent thing to do would have been to provide you with the link. You can kind of see it in here, but if you go onto Juvenile Law Center's website and just search for education, you'll find it, or you could, oh, that's the dramatic close, don't look. So, or you could just email me, and I, having failed to put the link, I'm fully responsible, so please do go ahead and email me, and I'll help you get signed up for that listserv. Now we can go back to our dramatic. Yeah, we thought that maybe like a duet or some kind of a musical interlude would be appropriate, but I find myself, I wonder if I can reach, the world that I'm usually in, I think, is that tangled part, and perhaps you are too, but it's just really exciting to be here and to have started the conversation. We look forward to hearing more tomorrow about how it is that this crazy tangle that we live in is going up to helping our youth.
I think Jessica and I have said many times that we don't spend enough time sort of pausing and looking back and realizing how far we've come and what the landscape looked like 10 years ago versus now. And I think when you do it, you start to get kind of recharged. And I was just telling somebody in the hallway today, I really feel like a little bit of that's what's good about today and tomorrow, is you're actually doing that for yourselves. And I think if somebody were to put somebody on the spot and be like, what have you done in Iowa? You're like, I don't know, we're just plugging along, we're trying the best we can. You really have made some great strides, and so we never spend enough time patting ourselves on the back, and so let's do that, but let's also use that time to strategically look forward and to see what the next set of changes you can identify.